DreamWorks has been quietly breaking a rule that every other animated studio follows, and almost nobody has named it. Every major studio has honored that contract for decades because honoring it is safe and profitable and gives people exactly what they came for. DreamWorks kept breaking it. Film after film, they built heroes who got to the ending and were missing something they went in with. It didn't come back. The film just left it there, as if the story was comfortable with the audience sitting in the discomfort of a win that cost more than expected. And if you've ever finished a DreamWorks film feeling genuinely moved, but also strangely heavier than you expected, that weight is the rule being broken. That weight is DreamWorks telling you the truth. The question worth asking is why they kept doing it. What did this studio believe about the people watching their films that made them willing to make this choice over and over, across decades? Because the choice was deliberate, and understanding it changes how you see everything they ever made. A hero who never loses anything real, never actually changes. They just get upgraded. They get the thing they were chasing, and the film ends, and you feel satisfied in the moment, but the feeling doesn't stay, because nothing genuinely at stake was ever genuinely lost. DreamWorks kept putting things genuinely at stake, and then they kept taking them. And what happened in the space the loss created is why these films still mean something. The place to start is Hiccup, because Hiccup's loss is the most visible and the most quietly devastating in the DreamWorks catalog. Hiccup wins. He proves himself to his father, saves his village, changes the entire relationship between Vikings and dragons, and becomes the person he spent his whole childhood being told he would never be. And he loses his leg, not temporarily, not as something the third act fixes, permanently. He wakes up in the final scene with a prosthetic, and the film moves on, matter-of-factly, as if this is simply what winning sometimes looks like. Most studios would have healed him. The healing would have been the emotional payoff, the evidence that sacrifice gets rewarded and courage gets compensated. DreamWorks said the leg doesn't come back. What he did cost him that. And the cost doesn't erase the victory, but the cost is real. And the film holds both of those things at the same time, without flinching. What that decision does to the viewer is make the victory feel true, in a way that clean victories rarely do. When you watch a hero win and watch what they won cost them something permanent, you understand, at a level deeper than thought, that this story is telling you something honest about how things actually work. Growth costs. Becoming who you need to become costs more than you budgeted for when you started. The film doesn't apologize for that. It just lets it be there, and trusts you to hold a moment that is simultaneously a triumph and a loss, and something you wouldn't undo, even knowing the price.
I'm sorry. For everything.
Yeah, me too.
That trust is everything. That exchange happens while Hiccup is still processing what his body is now. The film doesn't linger, it just lets it be there. And what it's telling you is something animated film had almost never said before, that the payment is part of the story even when it's uncomfortable to include it. DreamWorks included it, and that decision is why How to Train Your Dragon hits different than almost anything else in its genre. The specific nature of the loss matters too. It's physical and permanent, and visible every single time Hiccup takes a step for the rest of his life. DreamWorks made the consequence of heroism walk with the hero, and that choice communicates something no dialogue could communicate on its own. That the world these films are set in is real enough to leave marks, that bravery in a real world doesn't leave you whole, and that the marks don't make the bravery less, they make it more. Po from Kung Fu Panda loses differently, and his loss goes deeper because it isn't physical. It's the loss of the story he'd been telling himself his entire life. Po spent his whole childhood believing that becoming the Dragon Warrior would fix something fundamental. He's the outsider, the panda who doesn't fit anywhere he actually is, and the Dragon Warrior was the version of himself that would finally make sense of all of it. The prophecy would confirm what he secretly hoped was true, that the things making him wrong in his actual life would make him right in the life he was destined for. There is a psychology to this that most people recognize immediately, even if they can't name it. The destination as the explanation, the achievement as the answer to the question of whether you were worth it. Po didn't just want to be the Dragon Warrior because he loved Kung Fu, though he did. He wanted it because he needed an external authority to confirm what he couldn't confirm himself. And DreamWorks understood that this specific need, the need for confirmation to come from somewhere outside yourself, is one of the most quietly devastating things a person carries. And then Shifu opens the dragon scroll, and it's blank. No secret, no hidden power, no confirmation that Po was always special underneath everything. The scroll reflects back what's already there, and what's there is just Po, unglamorous, and exactly what he's always been.
It's blank.
What?
Here, look.
No, I am forbidden to look upon.
That's the moment the film is actually about, not the fight with Tai Lung. The moment Po has to absorb that there is no external confirmation arriving to tell him he's enough. The only thing that was ever going to make him enough is deciding that he already is. That decision can't be handed to him or earned through combat or delivered by a prophecy. He has to arrive at it himself, inside the grief of discovering that the thing he'd been running toward was empty. What makes Po's loss resonate so broadly is that almost everyone has a version of that scroll. The achievement, the moment when someone in authority finally confirms what you hoped was true. Most people spend years running toward that confirmation without ever asking whether receiving it would actually give them what they think it would. Po asks. The scroll forces the question, and the answer the film gives him is that the confirmation was never going to come from outside. It was always going to have to come from deciding to stop waiting for it. That's not a comfortable answer. DreamWorks gave it anyway, and they gave it to a children's audience, in a film with talking animals and slapstick, and a villain made of snow leopard muscle, which is the most DreamWorks thing they ever did, wrapping a genuinely difficult truth inside something warm and accessible enough that it could land before you had time to brace against it. By the time you realized what the scroll scene was actually saying, it had already said it, and it was already sitting in you, doing its work. Shrek's loss across the first two films is the one people feel most personally and can articulate least, and I think that's because it happens at a level most analysis doesn't go looking for. Shrek doesn't lose anything external. He gets the swamp back, he gets Fiona, he gets more or less the life he said he wanted. What he loses is the story he had about why solitude was the right choice. The walls weren't just practical. They were his entire framework for making sense of himself. Being alone wasn't a circumstance. It was an identity. I am the kind of thing people reject, so I have chosen rejection first and called it preference. That story was load-bearing. His entire sense of self depended on it being true. And then Fiona chose him anyway, and Donkey stayed anyway, and Harold accepted him anyway. And every time someone chose him, the story got harder to maintain, until eventually he had to do the one thing more terrifying than any villain he faced: let the story go. Stop being the ogre who chose the swamp because he was choosing the swamp, and figure out who he was without the walls doing the work of defining him.
For your information, there's a lot more to ogres than people think.
That scene plays as comedy, but it's Shrek doing something genuinely vulnerable in the only language he knows how to use. He's trying to explain himself. He's trying to be understood. And underneath the joke, you can hear the tension between the walls he built and the part of him that wants someone to see past them. The reason Shrek's loss is the one people feel most personally is that the story he was telling himself is the same story a lot of people are telling themselves right now. I chose this. The distance, the not needing anyone, all of it was a choice. And the choice feels like strength from the inside, even when it's protecting something that broke a long time ago. Shrek never calls it fear. He calls it preference. He calls it knowing who he is. He calls it ogres not getting happy endings, as if that's a fact about the world rather than a story he decided to believe, so he didn't have to find out whether it was true. What makes this the most quietly devastating loss in the franchise is that Shrek never has a dramatic moment of realizing the walls need to come down. It happens incrementally. The wall doesn't fall in one moment. It erodes. And DreamWorks made an entire franchise out of that erosion, patient and honest and deeply uncomfortable in the way that real change always is. The story he was telling himself, the one that said solitude was chosen and not imposed, that preference and fear were the same thing, that the life he had was the life he decided on, is the kind of story most people never get examined, because the examination hurts more than just living inside it. DreamWorks examined it anyway, film by film, choice by choice. Every time Donkey showed up, and Shrek didn't quite manage to close the door completely. That's where the real Shrek story lives. Not in the action, in the slightly open door. Hiccup in How to Train Your Dragon 3 loses in a way the first film prepared you for without you knowing, and it might be the most emotionally mature ending DreamWorks ever put on screen. He loses Toothless, not to death, not to a villain, not to a circumstance beyond his control. He loses him to the truth he spent 3 films arriving at, that the world they built together isn't safe enough for Toothless to stay in it. The thing Hiccup loves most cannot survive in the life Hiccup has built, and rather than fighting to keep what he has at the cost of what Toothless needs, Hiccup lets him go. Loss by choice is the hardest kind. When something is taken from you, the grief is clean. But when you're the one who lets go, the grief has a different quality. You have to live with whether you made the right call. You have to carry the weight of the decision rather than the weight of the circumstance. And you have to find out who you are in the life that exists after the thing that defined you is gone. DreamWorks made that the ending of a trilogy that started with a boy who just wanted to belong somewhere. And they did something even harder than showing the loss. They showed Hiccup at peace with it. Not immediately, not without grief, but genuinely at peace. The final scene of the trilogy shows him years later, with a family, returning to where Toothless is living his life, and the reunion is everything you hoped it would be. But the point is not the reunion. The point is that Hiccup built a full life in the space the loss created. He carried it and built anyway. And DreamWorks is telling you through that epilogue that this is what the hardest losses eventually make possible if you move through them rather than around them. Not forgetting, not replacing, building. The door that the loss opens is always bigger than the door that closed. Puss in Boots, in The Last Wish, loses something no previous DreamWorks hero had lost, his invincibility, literally and psychologically. Puss spent 8 lives treating his own existence as a renewable resource. Another adventure, another close call, another miraculous escape, and the cat walks away and moves on to the next one, because that's the story he's always lived inside. He is the legend, the one who always finds a way. That identity served the same function as Shrek's walls. It kept him from having to feel the weight of his own mortality, from having to slow down long enough to find out what he actually cared about. And then the doctor tells him he has 1 life left, and death starts following him, and the invincibility story collapses. What Puss loses is the ability to not care about losing. He spent 8 lives not caring. He gets 1 life, and suddenly everything is different. Not because anything external changed, but because scarcity changed the value of what he had. The film is brutally honest about what that does to a person. It doesn't make him braver. It makes him more afraid than he's ever been. The hero who always found a way starts running. Because when there's nothing left to burn, you find out very quickly that you've been using the burning to avoid the living.
Because Puss in Boots laughs in the face of death, right?
The moment Puss stops running is the most psychologically loaded moment in the film. He turns to face death not because he found courage, or because a speech handed him the ability to stand. He stops running because he finally understood that running was the problem. That every life he burned through in a blaze of adventure was a life he hadn't actually lived. A life spent at speed, so he never had to be still long enough to feel the weight of his own existence. Standing still and facing what's coming is the bravest thing he does in the entire film. DreamWorks made that the climax. Not a fight, not a power surge, a decision to stop moving and be present in the 1 life he has left. That's the win. And it only becomes possible through the loss. What the film is doing underneath all of this is making an argument that most people are living their lives at exactly the speed required to avoid feeling them. The busyness, the constant motion, all of it can function as the same armor Puss wore for 8 lives. Not armor against danger, armor against stillness, against the question that stillness brings. DreamWorks took that armor away from Puss and forced him to stand in the question. And what he found when the armor came off is what the film believes you will find too, that the life you have, the 1 life, is worth being present for. The film never says this explicitly. It doesn't need to. It shows you a cat who ran from everything and burned through 8 lives doing it. and then shows you what happens when there's nowhere left to run. The stillness that Puss finally stands in is the same stillness most people spend their entire lives engineering reasons to avoid. DreamWorks made it the climax, and by doing that, they made a case that the thing you're running from is the exact thing worth turning to face. Megamind's loss is the strangest in the DreamWorks catalog because it doesn't look like a loss at all until you understand what it cost him. Megamind wins, he defeats Metro Man, he takes the city, he gets everything a villain is supposed to want, and he immediately doesn't know what to do with any of it, because winning wasn't the point. The point was having an opponent, a purpose, a role in a story that gave his existence shape. Without Metro Man to push against, the villain identity that had organized his entire life lost its meaning, and what was left underneath was a person who had never been given permission to ask who he actually was, outside the role the world assigned him. The loss Megamind suffers is the loss of the only self he's ever known. That happens in real life constantly, to people who build their entire identity around a role that eventually ends, and find themselves standing in the rubble, genuinely not knowing who they are in the absence of the thing that defined them. The career ends, the marriage ends, the children grow up and leave, and you're left with the question Megamind couldn't avoid. Who am I when the thing that made me someone is gone? DreamWorks made a comedy about that, a genuinely funny, genuinely moving comedy about one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can have, and they stuck the landing because they didn't pretend the answer was easy. They let Megamind spend real time in the disorientation before showing him the way out. The way out, the film quietly argues, was always through. You have to lose the identity before you can find out what's underneath it. And what's underneath it, if you're willing to look, is always more than the role you were assigned. Megamind didn't find out he was a hero because someone told him he was. He found out because the loss of the villain identity left enough quiet for him to actually listen to himself for the first time. That's a truth about identity that most films never go near, because going near it means acknowledging that the self you've been presenting to the world might be a performance you built around a wound rather than a fact about who you are. Megamind's entire arc is that acknowledgement, and DreamWorks delivered it in a film with a giant robot and a blue supervillain with a comically oversized head. That contrast is the whole DreamWorks method. The harder the truth, the warmer the delivery. The bigger the wound, the funnier the wrapper, because the wrapper gets you in the door, and once you're in, the truth is already doing its work. The reason all of this matters is that these losses are doing something to the people watching that goes well beyond entertainment. In every case, the loss is the teacher. The loss is what cracks open the space the real growth moves into. Without it, there is no arrival at anything worth having, because you cannot arrive at something real by the route of only winning. And DreamWorks understood that at a level that most studios either didn't reach or weren't willing to act on. They built it into the architecture of their films, rather than leaving it as an accident or an afterthought. The loss was structural. It was load-bearing. Take it out, and the whole thing collapses into something you feel good about for an afternoon and forget by the weekend. DreamWorks understood something about the people in those seats that most studios weren't willing to act on, that adults watching these films have already lost things, that the children watching them are going to, and that a story pretending loss isn't part of the deal is a story that doesn't fully trust its audience. Every other studio was making films about the world as people wished it worked. DreamWorks kept making films about the world as it actually does, and they wrapped that truth in enough warmth and humor and genuine heart that you could receive it without bracing. What DreamWorks was really doing, across all of it, was making a sustained argument that the version of yourself who has never lost anything is not actually stronger than the version who has. The unscathed version is just the unlived one. The one-legged dragon rider, the panda who knows the secret, was never in the scroll. The ogre who chose to let someone love him anyway. Those people couldn't have existed without what it cost to become them. DreamWorks kept insisting on that truth in a genre that was built on the promise of a world where the truth doesn't have to cost that much. They made films that said, you are going to lose things you love, and that is not the end of the story. Surviving it, with something real built from what remains. That is what it actually means to be the hero of your own life.